16 Trail Society. On Saturday, they gathered with about 100 other Bulkley Valley residents to celebrate the completion of the first phase of a new off-highway bike trail between Smithers and Telkwa. Mr. Speaker, these folks have a vision. It's a vision of local families coming together for healthy, active lifestyles, a vision of clean, sustainable transportation, and a vision of people building good projects together in the proud tradition of small communities everywhere. I want to congratulate the Society's executive, Alan Cormier, Jeremy Schreiber, Mary Bryce, Janet Harris, Dan Boisevane, Teresa Monkman, Sue Harrison, Allison Watson, and Don Morgan. And a special tip of the bike helmet to my friend Tony Harris, who has been pushing on the pedals of this project since the very beginning. I rode the bike trail with my daughter 2 weeks ago, Mr. Speaker, and it is beautiful. Congratulations all.
Before going to the next member for his statement, I want to remind everyone that statements are taking place, and I'm sure everybody wants to hear what's being said. So if you're talking to each other, please whisper. Don't talk very loud. Thank you. L'honorable député de Drummond.
The Honourable Member for Drummond. Mr. Speaker, for 60 years, Éditions du Boréal has offered a showcase for our Québécois authors. In 1963, Gilles Boulet, Pierre Gravel, Jacques Lacourcière, Denis Vaugeois, and Monseigneur Albert Tessier founded Boréal Express, which went on to publish an impressive collection of historical works at the forefront of the Quiet Revolution and social changes sweeping Quebec in the 60s and 70s. Le Boréal has a rich history. It published some of the greatest names in Québécois literature, such as Marie-Claire Blais, Anne Hébert, Gabriel Roy, Robert Lalonde, Marie Laberge, and Dany Laferrière, and also some English-Canadian literary greats, including Margaret Atwood, Neil Basundath, and Michael Ondaatje. The list goes on, but one thing is sure, it will continue to grow. Thanks to Le Boréal, our stories are being heard around the world, and the people who tell them with their soul, their heart, and their words. Words in the language we speak here, without which the stories wouldn't be as authentic. Thank you, Boréal, and happy 60th.
The Honourable Member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Mr. Speaker, the Liberals are out of touch and Canadians are out of money. These inflationary deficits are causing Canadians to miss meals, use food banks, and for young people to abandon the hope of owning a home. In a couple more weeks, a second carbon tax will kick in, further driving up the price of gas to add 61 cents a litre, which is pouring more gas on the inflationary fire. Terrible. Mortgages and rents have doubled. The combined carbon taxes will cost families $4,000 extra a year. With all the wildfires raging in Canada, there will be stiff penalties for the arsonists responsible. But what will be the punishment for the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister who are deliberately setting the inflationary fire? I reiterate my party's call for the Liberals to work throughout the summer to draft a budget that will combat inflation, reduce interest rates, axe the carbon tax, and make it possible to build more homes. Your home, my home, our home. Let's bring it home! Yeah!
The Honourable Member for Kingston and the Islands.
Speaker, 1 week ago today, the Leader of the Opposition vowed to use all procedural tools to block the budget from passing, including 900 amendments and lengthy speeches. But despite his nearly 4-hour-long speech last Wednesday evening, during which he talked about Winston Churchill, Henry VIII, his favorite podcaster, Jordan Peterson, the stonework in Parliament, and why the floors in here are green, never once did he mention how the budget will support Canadians through expanding dental care, creating the new first home savings account, or investing in the clean economy that will create thousands of jobs for Canadians. Nonetheless, the very next day, this House passed Budget 2023. That will provide the much-needed supports for Canadians right across the country. While the Conservative Party continues to play procedural games, Mr. Speaker, this government will continue to do the hard work and deliver results for Canadians.
Oral questions. Question orale. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
The Prime Minister wasted 8 months
8 months ago, Canadians found out about the scope of Beijing's interference in helping the Liberals during 2 elections. He helped his ski buddy, who's a member of the Trudeau Foundation, in order to cover up this exact interference. Now, his reporter has stepped down. So we need a public inquiry. The Conservative Party is ready to work with all parties, including the government, in order to launch one. Will the government call a public inquiry so that we can know all of the details about Beijing's interference? The Honourable Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs. I appreciate my colleagues' desire to work as a team, collaboratively. We've said since the beginning that a public inquiry is an option. Mr. Johnston recommended against a public inquiry and explained that decision. He explained that it would be difficult given national security matters. We are willing to discuss and collaborate with the opposition to discuss a possible public inquiry, what the mandate might be of such a commission, and what the conditions would be. And we look forward to those discussions. Leader of the Opposition. Rents have doubled since the Prime Minister came into office. Mortgages have doubled since this Prime Minister became Prime Minister. They've spent $500 million, which made inflation rates skyrocket, and in fact, they are preventing the building of affordable housing units. Will the Prime Minister cancel his inflationary policies, balance the books, and cut paperwork and red tape so that we can build affordable housing for Canadians? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, last week, across the country, forest fires raged. It was very dangerous. We saw just how important it is to take action for the climate. What are the Conservatives doing? Did they work with us to support Canadians in this very important time through all these dangers? Do they support our industrial plan and economic plan to build a green economy? No, they did not support us. What they were doing was playing partisan games, and it's very irresponsible, Mr. Speaker. The opposition leader.
It's not going to stop forest fires, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has doubled housing costs by $500 billion of inflationary deficits and by giving billions of dollars to local gatekeepers who block housing construction with the second slowest housing permits of any country in the entire OECD. Now, the deficits the Prime Minister is running risk increasing interest rates further and causing people to lose their homes to higher mortgage prices. Will the government introduce a balanced budget to bring down inflation and interest rates so that Canadians don't lose their homes?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, when it comes to the OECD, what the Leader of the Opposition should know and should be sharing with Canadians is that last week the OECD forecast that Canada would have the strongest economic growth in the G7 over 23 and 24. But what is truly appalling, Mr. Speaker, and frankly really disappointing, is that these Conservatives, at a time when forest fires have been raging across our country, would prefer to play partisan games rather than support our sensible measures to build the clean economy we desperately need.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
The question was about the doubling of housing costs. This Prime Minister has brought in $500 billion of inflationary spending, which doubled rent costs, mortgage payments, and needed down payments for the average house. And now the IMF says that Canada is the country most at risk of a massive mortgage default, as our households have the most debt as a share of GDP of any country in the G7. That debt is about to collide with soaring interest rates driven by this government's deficits. Will they eliminate the deficits, balance the budgets to bring down inflation and interest rates before Canadians lose their homes?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm glad to hear the Leader of the Opposition cite the IMF. And I hope that that means he is aware that it is the IMF which confirms that Canada has the lowest deficit in the G7 and the lowest debt to GDP ratio in the G7 by some measure. But, Mr. Speaker, I really have to point out to the Canadians listening to us the appalling behavior of this reckless and irresponsible opposition, which has been blocking sensible, important measures to support Canadians at a critical time.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
It's not just homeowners, Mr. Speaker. Because this government has been giving billions to local gatekeepers who block affordable housing construction, and because their inflationary policies have doubled the rent, the students are now living in squalor. You used to be able to get an apartment, a full apartment, for $840 before this Prime Minister. Now, CBC is reporting that a student from Guelph has had to pay $840 just for a room in an apartment she shares with 6 other students that is mold and insect infested and doesn't even have running water. Will they reverse their inflationary policies so Canadians don't have...
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I want to take this opportunity to point out to Canadians the utterly irresponsible behavior of this Conservative Party in the House last week, blocking our budget legislation. The Prime Minister over the weekend made a very important trip to Ukraine to show Canada's support for Ukraine at this crucial moment. Meanwhile, you know what the Conservatives were doing, Mr. Speaker? Blocking our legislation, which would indefinitely deny most favored nation trading status to Russia and Belarus. Whose side are they on, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Member for La Prairie. Mr. Speaker, David Johnston made an honourable decision in stepping down to protect people's trust in democracy. That said, he should never have been put in that position. Starting in February, both Canadians and this House began calling for a public and independent commission of inquiry into Chinese interference, an inquiry whose commissioner would be chosen by the House to study both electoral interference and the issues of financing, threats, espionage, and intimidation of the diaspora. It was the right choice and remains the right choice. Will the government establish this commission before the end of the session? Because time is ticking. The Honourable Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs. Mr. Speaker, we look forward to working with our colleague from La Prairie, his party leader, and other party leaders. We will work together in order to strengthen Canadians' trust and confidence in our democratic institutions. Mr. Johnston's stepping down gives us the opportunity to take partisan fighting down a few notches and collaborate together to work on a public process for the next few steps. We look forward to working with opposition parties to discuss how we can do so responsibly and seriously. The Honourable Member for La Prairie. Mr. Speaker, for the Bloc Québécois, Mr. Johnston's departure in and of itself does not restore public trust in democracy. His regrettably botched report is the problem. He's suggested public hearings, which are merely an attempt to avoid a real inquiry. His report is proof that an independent public inquiry is absolutely essential. Today, the government is finally showing some signs of openness, which is good news for democracy, but the government must first clarify its intentions. Does it want to revive the David Johnston hearings under a new name, or is the government clearly committing to launching a true public and independent commission of inquiry? Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, as I said at the beginning of question period, that was always an option on the table. That said, I understand and we know that the Bloc Québécois will never form government. The Conservative Party knows full well that we can't have a public inquiry in some situations, such as when there are top-secret national security intelligence information involved. We cannot be irresponsible with that sort of information. So, Mr. Speaker, I think we would all benefit from a substantive discussion on the next steps of a possible public inquiry. So if there is an inquiry, we can discuss the timelines and the mandate. Honourable Member for Burnaby South.
Shot up so quickly that families are struggling to pay their mortgages. We give an example of someone in Toronto, an average family that bought an average home a year and a half ago. They would have to find now an additional over $27,000 by the end of this year. That is a shocking amount. What advice would this Prime Minister give to these families that are struggling with the cost of their mortgage for how they can come up with this additional amount of money?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Leader of the NDP for that really important question. We are absolutely aware that housing is a significant challenge for far too many Canadians. And that is why I am really glad that we have now put in place something we promised to do, which is the tax-free first home savings account. That is going to help a lot of first-time home buyers save for that crucial home. I'm also really glad, Mr. Speaker, that we have now put in place a $4 billion housing accelerator plan. Thank you.
The honourable member for Burnaby South.
None of that helps a family that's struggling with the cost of mortgage right now. Si je donne un exemple,
Here's an example, a similar example from Montreal this time. A family has to find an extra $13,000 a year. It's crazy. Families are already struggling to make ends meet. What advice does this government have for these Canadian families? How are they going to pay their bills and pay their mortgage?
Honorable Vice-Premier Ministre.
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our government agrees that housing may be the biggest issue for Canadians and for Canadian families. That's why we have already created a tax-free savings account for the purchase of a first property. This will be helpful, especially for young Canadians. We have also set up accelerator funds, housing accelerator funds. These will help municipalities to build more units that Canada really needs.
Mr. Speaker, it's been 8 months of denials, foot-dragging, and cover-ups for these Liberals when it comes to foreign interference in our election. Here's the numbers. Countless promises of protecting our democracy, hundreds of thousands to the Trudeau Foundation, one special rapporteur, and zero answers and zero results. The Prime Minister now gets to go back to the drawing board where he can keep delaying this investigation, continue his cover-up, and find someone else to do his bidding. The opposition has agreed to their new requests. When will he give up the charade and finally commit to a public inquiry?
The Honourable Minister for Intergovernmental Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, we think that a discussion about issues as important as protecting Canadian democratic institutions from unacceptable foreign interference would benefit from all of us lowering the partisan temperature.
That's right.
That's why, Mr. Speaker, we believe that the decision of Mr. Johnston to leave the special rapporteur's role gives all of us an opportunity to discuss what are the next steps in a public process. The opposition says they want a public inquiry. What would be the terms of reference of that inquiry? How would they protect necessary national security information in the interest of Canada? What would be the timelines? Those are the conversations we're anxious to have.
The Honourable Member for Thornhill.
Let's be clear, Canadians want a public inquiry. And this is the kind of thing we've been seeing for 8 months. The party who unequivocally rejected a public inquiry and ignored the will of this Parliament just weeks ago now says one has always been on the table. It should have been the first resort, not the last resort, and it's very clear they have no plan, and they never intended to investigate foreign interference in our election. When will they stop delaying this with their games and just call a public inquiry?
Hear, hear. The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it won't surprise you that I don't share some of the exaggerated premises of our honourable colleagues' questions. What we have said, Mr. Speaker, and members of the Conservative Party know this well, including the Leader of the Conservative Party, who sat in a government that was designed and decided to protect national security information from public release. They know that. So saying they want a public inquiry right now is not, in fact, a responsible suggestion. They should tell us what would be the terms of reference. How will they protect the national security interests of Canadians? Who might lead this process in a proper way?
The Honourable Member for Wellington Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, it's been 31 weeks, more than 7 months, since the news that the government knew about the PRC's interference in our democracy came to light. Since then, we've asked hundreds of questions in this House and in its committees, but we've gotten very few answers. The only thing we've gotten are a few answers here and there, heavily redacted documents, and a mountain of process, NSICOP and CIRA, a special rapporteur. Will the Prime Minister commit to a public inquiry with the full powers of a public inquiry so we can get answers to exactly what happened?
The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, the colleague across the way highlights the mechanisms that shine a light on how it is we're protecting our democratic institutions from foreign interference, including through the creation of NCCOP, a multi-partisan endeavor, including through the creation of NSIRA. And yes, Mr. Johnston, who is now determined that he will not be carrying on, has charted out a course. What's important is that we work together, Mr. Speaker, by addressing the concerns that have been raised with regards to foreign interference, but doing so in a way that is responsible to protect our national security. That remains the commitment of this government, and we look forward to taking the next concrete steps with all members in this chamber.
The Honourable Member for Wellington, Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, on a related national security matter concerning the Winnipeg lab breaches, it was 2.5 years ago that this House of Commons ordered the production of documents. The government refused to comply with the order, then they hid behind NCCOP, and now finally, 2.5 years later, the committee that is looking at these documents has just been stood up. Mr. Speaker, we can't wait 2.5 years for more process to unfold to get the answers we need about interference in our democracy that affects all members and all parties of this House. So, will the government commit today to a public inquiry so this democracy and Canadians across the country can get the answers they deserve about PRC interference?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, when Justice Iacobucci and Justice O'Connor made the recommendations about critical changes that needed to happen to make sure that parliamentarians could see into every corner of government, the Leader of the Opposition, as Minister at the time, ignored that request. In fact, if the Leader of the Opposition had his way, there would be no way to look at any national security documents. What we did in Winnipeg Labs, Mr. Speaker, is offer all of the documents to be seen at NSICOP. When they refused, we created an alternate process with a panel of independent arbiters that can look at every redaction to make sure they're legitimate. It took them nearly a year to agree to that process. They finally have. They took a long time to appoint their members. I'm glad they finally have.
The Honourable Député de Mégantic.
The Honourable Member for Mégantic-L'Érable. Why hasn't the Prime Minister already announced a public and independent inquiry into Beijing's interference? The Prime Minister has tried to cover up the help he received from the Beijing regime in the 2019 and 2021 elections. The cover-up was inventing the position of Special Rapporteur and entrusting the mandate to his friend, a member of the Trudeau Foundation. David Johnston resigned on Friday after being unable to prove beyond doubt that the appearance of a conflict of interest between him and the Prime Minister was unfounded. Will the Prime Minister launch an independent inquiry today and finally work with the opposition to ensure that Canadians can find out the whole truth? The Honourable Public Safety Minister. Mr. Speaker, the government is always ready to work with the opposition parties, including the Conservatives. However, the Conservatives continuously refuse to receive a briefing from the intelligence services. So I hope that today is an opportunity for us to truly work together with the opposition because this matter is incredibly important. It is essential that we look into and address the threats posed by foreign interference, and we must do this work together. The Honourable Member for Mégantic-L'Érable. So why, though, rather than making a decision immediately after David Johnston's resignation, as he could have done, why did he not immediately announce a public independent inquiry? Instead of doing that, he sent his friend to do a media campaign. When will the Prime Minister realize that he cannot accept foreign assistance to win elections and then decide how to investigate it? His plan to hide and buy time has failed miserably, so when will he put an end to the cover-up and finally order an independent public inquiry? The Honourable Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs. Mr. Speaker, it's very telling when we say that we want to work with the opposition to collaborate on an issue as important as protecting our democratic institutions, but then my friend across the way calls that political games. There has been too much partisanship and too many political games in this matter, including from the part of the Conservatives. We are ready to work together so that we can determine the best way to move forward. We look forward to substantive discussions with the opposition. The Honourable Member for Trois-Rivières. Mr. Speaker, David Johnston was caught in a trap. From the outset, the mandate that the Prime Minister assigned him was at odds with the wishes of both the public and the House. Now that he has honorably stepped down, the government is showing signs of openness and is even calling for candidates to be put forward for an inquiry. Well, all right, the Bloc Québécois will cooperate, but the government must first clarify what kind of inquiry it will be. Will it be a public and independent commission of inquiry, or rather restricted hearings with no real power or independence? In other words, do they want the names of commissioners or the names of people to trap, like Mr. Johnston? The Honourable Public Safety Minister. Mr. Speaker, from the outset, we have always been willing to work with the Bloc. In fact, we invited the Bloc and all members to receive briefings from intelligence services so that we could all make decisions on the same basis, being aware of the same facts and information. So we are willing to work together. All options are still on the table. We need to do this work together in order to better protect our democratic institutions. The Honourable Member for Laurentides-Labelle. Mr. Speaker, David Johnston's resignation puts us back to square one. For nearly 4 months, the government has been doing everything it can to avoid an inquiry. The Bloc Québécois welcomes the government's openness today, but after 4 months, the government needs to get its act together. A public and independent commission of inquiry is necessary. The commissioner must be chosen by the House and must be able to define its mandate with broad enough scope to answer all of the public's questions. Is the government prepared to launch such an inquiry before the end of the session? Yes or no? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, with all due respect for my colleague, we are not back to square one. A lot of work has been done. There is a lot of tangible information and there has been tangible action. We have created the position of a national coordinator. We have started work on a register. There were also investments in the budget 2023 to add more resources for the RCMP and to protect Canadians. There's a host of examples of measures that we have already taken, but now we need to take this issue very seriously. We need to work in a focused way, and we are, of course, always willing to work with the opposition. The Honourable Member for Laurentides-Labelle. Mr. Speaker, we have been talking about this every day since February. Everyone is already calling for a public and independent commission of inquiry, including the former Director of Elections Canada, former members of intelligence services, senior civil servants, not to mention Canadians, and minorities threatened by the Chinese regime. The House, too, would like such an inquiry. Now, of course, it will be in-camera sessions. As with any commission of inquiry, which deals with sensitive content, there's no lack of means to investigate. What's lacking is the government's will to investigate. So, public and independent commission of inquiry, yes or no? The Honourable Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs. Mr. Speaker, I'm encouraged by our colleagues' comments when it now, as for the type of inquiry, well, the colleague described one challenge that we face. There are top secret facts, there's top secret information here that our intelligence agencies deal with. So instead of repeating the same things, we would like to hear concrete suggestions on how we can protect sensitive top secret information. We'd also like suggestions about the type of person who would be ideal to lead these public inquiries, and also suggestions about deadlines.
The Prime Minister has racked up more debt than all other prime ministers combined. That's just not just a shocking fact, but the real-life consequences is that massive Liberal deficits raises the inflation rate, which then forces the Bank of Canada to raise the interest rates, which is forcing Canadians to default on their mortgages. Mr. Speaker, Canadians are going bankrupt because these Liberals can't control the government spending. Right. When will they get their spending under control?
Right. The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the member opposite has the privilege of representing Edmonton Millwoods, a riding in a fabulous city that is lucky to have a large Ukrainian-Canadian community. And so, Mr. Speaker, I hope that the member opposite is embarrassed by and ashamed of the childish filibustering of this Conservative Party, which blocked crucial support from our country to Ukraine. This party blocked the denial of most favored nation trading status to Russia. They should be ashamed of themselves, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member for Edmonton Mill Woods.
Mr. Speaker, almost half of Canadians say that they're having a difficult time now managing their mortgage payments. More and more Canadians are taking on credit card debt just to pay for basic necessities like groceries. So now will the Liberals work with us to draft a new budget that will stop the deficits, that will stop the inflation, and will stop rates from going up, and which will stop the mortgage defaults? Mr. Speaker, will these Liberals cancel their vacation, work with us, and help Canadians save their homes?
The Honourable Minister for Families.
Well, Mr. Speaker, despite the childish and immature and irresponsible games of the Conservatives, this House actually passed the budget last week. And it's a good thing that we did do that, Mr. Speaker, because there's real help in that budget for Canadians. Let's talk about, as of July 5th, the grocery rebate is going to reach 11 million Canadians. Mr. Speaker, the first-time home buyer savings account is also part of that, Mr. Speaker. And the investments in clean technology that are going to help us fight climate change, but also build the economy of the 21st century. This side of the House passed that.
The Honourable Member for Bellechasse-les-Etchemins-Lévis. Hello, Mr. Speaker. This government is spending recklessly, and this creates serious problems in the country. Just last week, the Bank of Canada was forced to react to the Prime Minister's inflationary policies by raising interest rates for the 9th time, Mr. Speaker. Canadians are already saddled with mortgage payments that have doubled, and some can't keep up and end up defaulting on their payments. Can the Prime Minister commit to immediately halting his deficits and inflationary spending and table a plan to balance the books? The Honourable Minister for Sport. Mr. Speaker, I know that the Conservatives would prefer to forget the past few years and to forget everything Canadians have gone through over the past few years, such as the pandemic. Our government chose to be there for Canadians when they needed it. We supported businesses, we supported people, we prevented people from losing their homes during the pandemic when they couldn't work. You know what's ironic today is that the Conservatives acknowledge that Canadians are suffering, but instead of proposing anything concrete or tangible, they're just trying to block our budget, which would help people. It makes no sense, Mr. Speaker.
Stood with Indigenous Chiefs of Police of Ontario who are trying to negotiate to keep their communities safe. This government is fine to enforce policies that were found to be discriminatory by the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. They are fine to let the funding for First Nations policing run out. This would never happen in major cities. Why is this government forcing the Indigenous Chiefs of Police of Ontario, forcing to accept them a contract which goes against reconciliation?
The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, first I want to begin by thanking my colleague for her question and for her advocacy in the space of First Nations policing. I want to assure her that I've had constructive discussions with Chief Kailu over the course of the weekend, and I want to assure all members in this chamber that we are committed to resolving this situation as quickly and as respectfully as we can. Mr. Speaker, the statements made by the community earlier today are with merit. It is a reminder that we have a long way to go when it comes to reconciliation, and that is why this government remains committed to doing that work in partnership based on respect for the community.
The Honourable Member for Vancouver East.
International students who's been defrauded by crooked consultants should not be punished with deportations and inadmissibility based on misrepresentation. They have invested everything they have for a better future. They work hard, they study hard, and under very difficult conditions. They are under enormous strain, and their lives are in limbo. The Liberals can eliminate this uncertainty by allowing them to stay in Canada and build the life of their dreams. Will the minister do the right thing, the compassionate thing, and grant these international students a pathway to permanent residency?
The Honourable Minister for Immigration.
Mr. Speaker, I agree with much of my honourable colleague's question, and I'm glad to share that we've been working very hard, as we've discussed in a recent meeting just a little more than a week ago. We are working to develop a process to ensure that those innocent students who are the victims of fraud will have an opportunity to remain in Canada. However, to the extent that people committed fraud or were complicit in a fraudulent scheme, they will bear the consequences of choosing not to follow Canada's laws. I am hearing stories of students who are dealing with serious mental health concerns, with the uncertainty that they are struggling with. We will put a process in place to allow them to prove that they were taken advantage of and provide an appropriate remedy for them.
The Honourable Member for Etobicoke Centre.
Mr. Speaker, this past weekend, as Ukrainians continue to fight valiantly for their freedom and for ours, our Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister made another visit to Kyiv to meet with President Zelensky and Prime Minister Shmyhal. For more than a year, Canada has remained a steadfast ally of Ukraine, with significant military aid, financial aid, sanctions on Russia, supports for Ukrainians fleeing the war, and much more. In light of the Prime Minister's visit, can the Minister of Foreign Affairs share with Canadians some of the latest measures the Government of Canada has announced to support the Ukrainian people and hold Russia to account?
The Honourable Minister for Foreign Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's a great question. Well, in Kyiv, the Prime Minister announced $500 million more in military support, including that Canada will help train Ukrainian fighter pilots. And we also announced the seizure of the Russian Antonov plane stranded at the Pearson Airport. This is the first physical asset targeted, and with our new seizure and forfeiture powers, we are the first of our allies to make sure that we're using these powers. We know that we have to do more, and we will do more, and there will be nowhere to hide for those who profit from the illegal.
The Honourable Member for Calgary, Forest Lawn.
The Finance Minister said that she would end her inflationary deficits and balance the budget by 2027. Just months after that, she admitted she'll run deficits forever and balance the budget in the year never. 8 years of massive Liberal deficits gave Canadians the highest bank interest rate hikes not seen in the last 20 years, and now the International Monetary Fund is reporting Canada is highest at risk for mortgage default crisis. When will the Finance Minister end her inflationary spending and give us a date of when she'll balance the budget so Canadians don't lose their homes?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservative finance critic is a serious adult. That's why it's been frankly so embarrassing to watch juvenile staffers from the Conservative leader's office bully him and other Conservative members of the Finance Committee and force them to play juvenile partisan games and filibuster legislation that will provide Canadians with support they need right now. It was embarrassing to watch, Mr. Speaker, and it shows how irresponsible these Conservatives are.
Well, Member for Calgary, Forest Lawn.
What's embarrassing is while Canadians are suffering, that Finance Minister dumped a $60 billion jerry can of fuel on the inflationary fire that she started. Liberals don't understand that reducing the deficits would reduce inflation, would reduce bank interest rates, which would reduce the risk of default mortgage crisis. The interest rate hikes will cost an extra $1,300 a month on already struggling Canadians paying their mortgages, which average are costing $3,000. If the Liberals don't have any plans to reduce this deficit, will they at least get out of the way so Conservatives can save Canadians' homes?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it is really astonishing that these Conservatives would have the temerity to talk about fires burning in Canada. Because the fact is, fires have been burning in Canada. They've been burning in Quebec, they've been burning in Atlantic Canada, and they have burning in the finance critic's home province of Alberta. But what have the Conservatives done in response? They have fought a price on pollution, the best way to fight climate change, and they have fought our budget, which has a clear plan to fight climate change and create great jobs for Canadians. Appalling.
The Honourable Member for New Brunswick Southwest.
Mr. Speaker, the Liberal government has run massive deficits for 8 long years, and as predicted, inflation has soared, leading to unaffordable mortgage rates for households across this country. Canadians today have the highest household debt in the G7, And today we now have the highest risk of mortgage default in the OECD nations. The solution is obvious. End deficit spending, stop the inflation, and help Canadian families. So will the Prime Minister and his government commit to ending his inflationary spending to prevent a fiscal crisis?
The Honourable Minister for Immigration.
Mr. Speaker, to be absolutely clear, the honourable member's question when he refers to deficit spending is largely referring to the supports that kept families fed during the pandemic. The programs that we put forward help keep the roof over kids' heads in my community. It helps small businesses keep the lights on and the doors open. And jeer during my responses they made. They know that this is true. In fact, they knew that...
Going to interrupt the Honourable Minister. We're doing so well, and now suddenly everything, I'm not sure what's going on, but the volume seems to be going up. I'm going to ask everyone so that the member for New Brunswick Southwest can hear the answer to his question. I'm going to ask the Minister of Immigration to, maybe he's got about 30 seconds left. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The deficit spending that they're talking about included the pandemic supports that made sure that families in my community could keep food on the table and a roof over their kids' heads. Those supports help small businesses keep the lights on and the doors open. And here they are now blaming the Canadians who availed themselves of those pandemic benefits on deficit spending that they now are attributing to inflation. The reality, Mr. Speaker, is they don't support these spending now, and at the time their leader held a press conference and said, he's a conservative, he doesn't support those big fat government programs. Well, I support them because they kept my neighbors fed when they needed it.
The Honourable Member for New Brunswick Southwest.
Mr. Speaker, that is absurd. $200 billion was spent during the pandemic that had nothing to do with helping Canadians. This government just added another $60 billion to their inflationary bonfire, and they now have deficits for as long as the eye can see. Yes. Canadians are struggling to put food on their table. They're cancelling their summer vacation because of this Liberal-caused inflation. On our side of the House, we're willing to work all summer to fixally bring down and make home ownership and hard work affordable again. Yep. So will the Prime Minister cancel his summer vacation? Will he get to work, or a surfboard rental?
The Honourable Minister for Families.
Mr. Speaker, what the member opposite is saying is absolutely false. What we did during the pandemic was support Canadians. And when he's talking about that additional funding, he's talking about things like childcare. $30 billion that is helping Canadians access childcare. We don't know how the Conservatives are going to vote on it, but what we heard during their speeches in the House, Mr. Speaker, that they're pretty against affordable childcare. They're pretty against Canadians having access to thousands of dollars in their pockets at the end of the year that's helping them pay for the high cost of groceries, that's helping them with their mortgages, that's helping them take maybe a family vacation. Mr. Speaker, let's see what they do. Let's see if they truly care about Canadians.
The Honourable Member for Berthier-Masquinongé. Mr. Speaker, when our farmers and producers called on the emergency account during the pandemic, they did not foresee all the other things that would fall on their heads. The war in Ukraine, which caused input prices to soar, an inflation rate already 3 times worse than in other industries, $8 of debt for every dollar of income, and a key interest rate that is still rising, and we can go on and on and on. Result, 1 in 10 farm businesses is afraid of closing within a year. Firstly, is the Minister for Finance going to postpone payment of the emergency account for farmers without them losing the subsidy portion? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for his question. Of course, we're working with the agricultural sector to make sure that there is a just and equitable profit in their farms. We've increased the payments up to $350,000 without interest, which will help our farming families throughout Quebec and Canada. The Honourable Member for Berthier-Masquinongé. The question was for the Minister for Finance, but whatever. It would be nice to get some answers from her. Can we at least postpone the repayment of the account? Agriculture is hit even harder than the rest of the economy by inflation, especially. That is why other governments are taking action. The Americans have invested $22 billion in agriculture. Quebec has taken action with aid from the Financière Agricole. Now it's up to Ottawa to do its bit. Current programs are inadequate to deal with this exceptional crisis, which requires exceptional assistance. When will the government finally support our farmers and producers? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as the daughter of a farmer, I fully understand the importance of our agricultural sector, and I agree with my honourable colleague that our farmers and producers are exceptional. They're essential for our communities and for our economy, and that is the reason for which our government was here during the pandemic. Yes, spending was up, but it was essential to support our farmers and producers, and will continue to help them.
The honourable member for Hastings, Lennox and Addington.
Mr. Speaker, it's no secret that this government's record deficit spending has shot inflation through the roof. As a result, Canadians are spending more on food than ever before. This is particularly marked in rural communities like my own, where higher shipping costs add on to the cost of the end product and will only continue to get more expensive with this government's carbon taxes. Mr. Speaker, will this government finally acknowledge the damage their lavish and out-of-control spending is having on the kitchen table? Canadians are needing help. They need to end their inflation-inducing monetary policy. Will they do it?
Wow. The Honourable Minister for Families.
Mr. Speaker, we know that Canadians won't receive any help from the Conservatives because their plan is austerity, austerity, austerity. And in opposition, Mr. Speaker, our government is committed to supporting Canadians. In fact, inflation is a global phenomenon, and a recent report noted that Canada actually has the second lowest food inflation in the world. It doesn't mean that Canadians aren't hurting, and that's why we brought forward the grocery rebate that as of July 5th, 11 million Canadians are going to receive, and that's in addition to the Canada Child Benefit, early learning and childcare, the rental benefit. Mr. Speaker, we've been there for Canadians.
The honourable member for Hastings, Lennox and Addington.
Mr. Speaker, unlike the federal government, struggling Canadians cannot simply print more money. They need to manage their budgets and spend within their means. They cannot impose a series of punitive taxes on their neighbours to balance their books. They need to manage their finances with the added hurdle of reduced spending power. So, Mr. Speaker, when will this government stop spending, reduce inflation, and lower massive grocery bills?
The Honourable Minister for Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, as I've said many times in this House, I think we can all agree that affordability is an important issue. That is why there is a rebate with respect to the price on pollution to ensure that we are actually addressing this in a thoughtful way. But my goodness, when we are seeing the evacuations of people across this country, it is time that the Conservative Party started to think about climate change. I don't know whether they don't believe it's real or they just don't think it's important, but Canadians certainly do.
The honourable member for Beauce. Mr. Speaker, after 8 years of this government, many families across the country are struggling to put food on the table. Now, mortgages, car payments and credit card interest will go up yet again. Everything is going up under this Prime Minister. The Liberal government's deficits are to blame, but it refuses to take responsibility. Food prices will continue to skyrocket if no one takes action. When will the Prime Minister wake up and propose a real solution to this crisis? The Honourable Minister for the Environment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think that there is an increasing number of people who are watching us at home and who have been overtaken by the fact that the Conservatives are doing nothing about climate change. We've had the biggest tropical storm on the East Coast, our worst flooding ever, and now the biggest forest fires in our history. What are the Conservatives saying about climate change? Well, we don't believe in it. Or even worse, there's a magic wand somewhere that will one day fix climate change overnight. That's not how the real world works. On this side, we believe in climate change and we work on it every single day. The Honourable Member for Madawaska Restigouche. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week marks the 31st National Public Service Week, which recognises the valuable work of federal public servants from coast to coast to coast, year after year after year. Can the President of the Treasury Board explain to the House why all Canadians should recognise the hard work of federal public servants? The Honourable President of the Treasury Board. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for Madawaska Restigouche for his important question and for his diligent work for his community. As President of the Treasury Board, I see every day the dedication of federal public servants in ensuring that the government acts in the best interest of Canadians. And I'd like to thank them. Whether it's paying benefits to seniors or protecting our borders, Canadians are well served by our hardworking, committed and professional public service. I hope everyone has a wonderful National Public Service Week.
The Honourable Member for Charleswood St. James, Assiniboia Headingley.
Mr. Speaker, this is a very serious problem. Massive Liberal deficits are fueling inflation. Inflation causes interest rates to go up. Higher interest rates lead to higher mortgage payments and more mortgage defaults. To stop mortgage defaults, we need to balance the budget, end the big deficits, and reduce interest rates. Will the Prime Minister end his inflationary deficit spending so Canadians can afford to live?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Speaker, it's time for Conservatives to be honest and transparent with Canadians. So what they have to answer is, what would they cut? Would they cut the $200 billion that we're investing in healthcare? I sure hope not, because Canadians need a healthcare system they can rely on. Would they cut the $30 billion we are investing in early learning and childcare? I sure hope not, because that is making a real difference to families across our country and helping our labour market to boot. Would they cut dental care? Would they cut removing interest on federal student loans?
The Honourable Member for Charleswood St. James, Assiniboia and Headingley.
Well, that's certainly not a very serious answer, Mr. Speaker. The bank governor is working to rein in inflation by increasing interest rates. At the same time, the Prime Minister's massive $60 billion spending spree is fueling inflation and has caused yet another interest rate hike just last week. While the Liberals are making the Bank of Canada's job even harder, it's ordinary Canadians who will be dropping their keys off at their banks and saying goodbye to their homes. Will the Prime Minister put an end to his inflationary deficit spending and let Canadians keep their homes?
The Honourable Minister for Immigration.
Mr. Speaker, earlier in question period, I reminded the Conservatives that their leader at the beginning of the pandemic held a press conference where he decried our pandemic benefits as big fat government programs. If you watch that video on the internet, that member who posed the question is standing behind him. Mr. Speaker, the reality is the spending that we put in place has supported people through the pandemic. The Conservative solution to the cause of inflation is to spend less money on supporting the households who need it. Mr. Speaker, we're going to continue to be there for Canadians to support health care, to help protect our environment, and to make life more affordable. It is a shame that they won't join us.
The Honourable Member for Montmagny, Lillet, Kamouraska, Rivière-du-Loup. Mr. Speaker, the deficits, as this Prime Minister is accumulating as if there were a collection of deficits, have increased inflation. And inflation has caused the Bank of Canada to raise interest rates 9 times. Homeowners paying their mortgages saw the effects immediately. The IMF has warned Canada that it is at risk of defaulting on its debts. That's the situation in which we are, Mr. Speaker, which is unfortunate. Will the Prime Minister finally stop his inflationary deficits? The Honourable Minister for Health. Mr. Speaker, the Minister for Finance a couple of minutes ago talked about a juvenile attitude from the official opposition when they refused last week to work towards adopting the budget. The good news is that my colleague on the other side also has a juvenile population. There are many young people, 12,000 children, who get the universal childcare benefit that will be strengthened in a few weeks, and close to 500 children who've been able to get improved dental care. Do the children of his riding not deserve this?
For Mississauga, Streetsville.
Tobacco use is the leading preventable cause of disease and continues sadly to kill 48,000 Canadians each year. Marginalized and underserved populations such as people with low incomes, racialized, Indigenous, or those with a mental health diagnosis experience even higher rates of tobacco use and greater tobacco-related health gaps. Can the Minister for Mental Health and Addictions update this House on how our government is using every evidence-based tool at our disposal to help protect the health of Canadians, especially young people?
The Honourable Minister for Mental Health.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the member for her question and for her tireless advocacy. It is essential that we take bold action to help people stop smoking and help young people to live healthy, tobacco-free lives. Canada's recently made cigarette health warnings unavoidable by becoming the first country in the world to require they be printed directly on individual cigarettes. This, along with updated and periodic rotation of health messages on tobacco packaging, packaging will ensure that we reach our target of less than 5% by 2035.
The honourable member for Cowichan, Malahat, Langford.
Mr. Speaker, families have been struggling to keep up with growing food prices, forcing kids to turn to school lunch programs. The Breakfast Club of Canada now provides breakfast for more than 600,000 students. 600,000. 2 years ago, it was just over 250,000. Canadian nutrition programs can't keep up with the demand or the cost to feed students as grocery prices soar. This government needs to stop dragging its heels. Will the Liberals make sure our students are fed by immediately setting up the National School Food Program?
Hear, hear. The Honourable Minister for Families.
I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for his question, and I look forward to working with him on this important issue. We know that because of high food prices right now, many school food programs are struggling to keep up with the cost, and we know how essential school food programs are to children right across this country. That's why over the past year I've been engaging in consultations both with schools, with school food providers, with stakeholders, with children, to gain their input into how we can bring forward a national school food policy. I look forward to sharing the results of those consultations with this chamber shortly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Next, the honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The climate crisis demands of us action that's twofold. First, to end our addiction to fossil fuels so we can avoid the worst, and second, to prepare for what we can no longer avoid. We had excellent nonpartisan briefings from the Minister of Emergency Preparedness for all parties. Today, as I read that California's insurers are no longer prepared to insure for fires and floods, we know what's coming, and yet we are not prepared. My question to the Prime Minister is, can we prepare as we would in wartime, the equivalent of a war cabinet of all parties together, taking this seriously to protect Canadians?
The honourable member the honourable minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for a very important question. And, Mr. Speaker, as we see an increase in the severity and the frequency of weather-related disasters, we recognize the importance of ensuring that Canadians have access to affordable and accessible home insurance. And it's why we've been working with the insurance industry to ensure, first of all, to develop a national flood insurance plan, but also to ensure that Canadians have all of the tools that they need to manage risks, including home insurance.
Bill, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for question period today. C'est tout le temps. Nous avons un rappel au règlement, l'honorable député de Mégantic.
The honourable member for Mégantic-L'Érable. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hope that you'll find unanimous consent to adopt the following motion: that the House A, express its solidarity and its support for all populations suffering from the forest fires. B, note that climate change have direct effects on the quality of life of the population and that it exacerbates the frequency and the amplitude of extreme weather events like tornadoes and heat waves. C, recognise that the federal government has to do more in order to fight climate change when it comes to preventing its impact and supporting communities that have been affected by natural resources. And D, ask the federal government to take concrete measures to contribute to fighting climate change that risk to become worse and worse for the population and for the environment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.